Maybe Dan, you'll be next.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm just going to be screen sharing here for a few minutes, and then I will go ahead and take that down so you can see all of our lovely panelists. But I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Know that this session is being recorded, and we're going to share the recording afterwards. So don't feel like you need to be taking serious notes the entire time. You can always go back and rewatch. So good day, everyone, and welcome to today's SAAL structured conversation. Again, this session is being recorded. My name is Tori Rare. I'm a senior consultant at The Ohio State University and a member of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee. I'll be one of our moderators today, along with Marianne, who's going to introduce herself in just a minute. On behalf of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Sal and our committee are committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and topics in our offerings to meet your professional development needs. You can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal. More information can be found on the Sal Structured Conversations page. We'll drop that link into the chat in just a moment. During this presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions, sharing comments through the chat function. We're going to be monitoring throughout, and then at the end, we'll have some time for some Q&A with our panelists. So today's panel is part of a two-part series on pathways to senior leadership for assessment professionals, where we'll discuss navigating role transitions and the skills needed to succeed in senior level roles. We've been hearing from our membership that they are interested in senior level roles, but they aren't sure how to make that transition or what a senior level role entails. Today's panel will focus on preparation for and challenges in senior level roles, as well as how daily responsibilities shift during this transition. Part two will be coming up in May, and we will share the link to that registration in the chat as well. We have three panelists today. I'll let them do a more thorough introduction in just a moment, but briefly they are Dr. Daniel Bureau, who's the Associate Vice President for Student Wellbeing at the University of Kentucky, Dr. Michael, Dr. Michael Christakis, the Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment at the University at Albany, who is generously joining us shortly after traveling, so thank you. And then Dr. Nicole Long, who's the Associate Vice President for Student Experience and Belonging at the University of Delaware. My fellow Professional Learning and Development Committee member, Marianne, will be co-facilitating. Marianne, could you introduce yourself and turn things over to our presenters?
Yes, thank you, Tori. So my name is Marianne Bujicic. I am an institutional research analyst at Georgetown University, and I'm also a member of the SAAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. And so I'll go ahead and start with the first question to our panelists. Can you briefly describe your current role, career path, and how assessment work featured in your early or mid-career roles? And Dan, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Tori, both of you for coordinating this. Such a pleasure to be with Michael and Nicole as well, and always love coming back to the SAL community, a very early home for me in terms of my professional development. So I came up through the functional area of fraternity and sorority life, leadership programs, and student organizations. I spent 10 years there, and I was reflecting on some of the early influences that I had there that allowed me to gain expertise in those functional areas but then also develop my skill set within assessment. And I was fortunate to work at the University of Illinois, where Tom Grayson was the director of student affairs assessment, a very early leader in the field. This was around the early 2000s, and he was very influential as I considered going and doing my doctoral work. I was able to do that doctoral work at the Indiana University and worked at the Center for Post-Secondary Research for the National Survey of Student Engagement. So fell early into that kind of line of using data in order to determine the extent to which students are meaningfully involved in educationally enriching activities. Spent my entire 4 years working there. And then after that, my first job with my doctorate was as the Director of Student Affairs Learning and Assessment at the University of Memphis. I would tell you all that my early interest in student affairs assessment was not about crunching numbers. I got a B in my stats class in my doctoral program, was not an expert by any means in that, but I really leaned into this kind of thought about organizational effectiveness. And I always had that disposition when I was doing work in a functional area. And then after my doctoral work and got that first job, I was fortunate to work at the University of Memphis and doing that work as the director of student affairs assessment, which allowed me to work with a bunch of different areas that I had not worked with previously. And you develop those skill sets And so you're thinking more and more about how do you kind of take this ethos of wanting to use data for better practice? How do you take this ethos of wanting to just drive organizational improvement? And I was able to apply that. I mean, many of you know that, many of you do that work. I also, around this time, had been appointed on behalf of AFA, the Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors, for whom I had served as president, was able to serve as the Council for the Advancement of Standards liaison. And I've served as part of CAS since 2008. I know we have some folks on today who are also actively engaged in CAS. Those early days of working in a functional area, working with CAS, then going into student affairs assessment really drove this kind of even stronger commitment to elevating the services across an entire division. And my vice president at the time, Dr. Rosie Phillips Bingham at Memphis, said, I want you on my leadership team. We're going to bring you on there. So I was the director of student affairs assessment doing special projects and being engaged that way. So she wanted me to look up in terms of how senior leaders at the institution at the University of Memphis were kind of enacting this improvement ethos, but also pull in some of my background and experiences in student life, leadership development, those kinds of things, and help the functions at Memphis do that. So I've been thinking about that throughout my early career, fell into it to many in many ways, moved into senior leadership roles, but I've always kind of brought that ethos around how do you improve organizations through sound assessment and using assessment in order to improve practice. So I'll stop there. I think I might have answered the question. But anyway, that was kind of my early days of working in how I've kind of taken an assessment into these positions of senior leadership. Who's next?
Mike, can you briefly describe your current role, career path, and how assessment work featured in your career?
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Sorry. Like Tori had said, I'm en route. So my bars, I've got two bars right now. So it's this whole Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now? But I'm going to try my best to stay connected while I get to campus. Thanks again for having me. Always really great to be with SAAL friends and your faces here. Really delighted to be able to join Dan and Nicole in this conversation. My functional area was residential life. I started as a hall director and then moved into the assistant director role ultimately. As some of you know, I know Dan and I have talked about this before, I had just completed my PhD, and about a couple weeks later, the director of housing called me into her office and said, I need you to look through this binder of data. And this was when we were doing the ACUHO-I, EBI benchmarking surveys. I don't know if many of you remember those days. Lots of questions, lots of data, and Lori Garofalo at the time was trying to figure out how to make heads or tails of it. So I did say to her at that particular juncture, I don't do assessment, Lori. And she goes, well, you're going to now. And so that became part of my responsibility in Res Life. I did that for probably two and a half years, trying to build a culture of assessment in residential life. And then was effectively called into the vice president's office during a leadership transition and was asked to move over to the VP's office and in part begin leading a newly developed assessment area, which again, at that point, 2.5, 3 years in Res Life. And we were sort of new in this. I will say one of the driving factors to the vice president at the time inviting me to join was that we were about to come up on our reaccreditation. We're a middle states institution. And so we were coming up on our reaccreditation in about 2 years, 2.5 years. During the previous reaccreditation, student affairs in particular, had been dinged on not collecting data or using data to inform decisions. And so Chris Bouchard, to her credit as VP, was trying to get ahead of it as best as she thought she could to do that. And so brought me over to try to establish an assessment program in student affairs in the division, which I did for a period of, it was probably 6 or 7 years. And happy to say that we, I think, did begin to move the needle in terms of broader buy-in by directors and units to be gathering data, closing the loop with students, using data to inform decisions, things of that nature. I will also tell you a fun little tidbit. We actually got a commendation during the accreditation review for the work that we were doing in student affairs at the time. So not only did we deliver, we delivered and got credit for delivering, which was a point of pride for, I know, Chris as vice president, but certainly for us more broadly in student affairs. I've been engaged, of course, in the assessments since the lead. We'll have opportunity through data-informed decisions as best as we can. And that's been, I think, core to how we've tried to lead here at Albany over the last many years.
Now, I guess round us out on the intros, and I'll try to be brief so we can get to more of the conversation. So I would say for me, I've always had an interest in numerical information and problem solving. As an undergraduate student, I did my bachelor's degree in mathematics. And so, but then ended up going into student affairs. And I think of like, particularly my student affairs experience as kind of the Jill of all trades in many ways. I started off doing student diversity programming and fraternity and sorority advising for multicultural Greek chapters and the National Panhellenic Council chapters as well early in my career. But I did serve as a member of a divisional diversity committee at my very first job at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which had a very robust assessment program within student affairs. Not necessarily coordinated divisionally in the ways that we see now at most institutions, but there was certainly an expectation that we are using data information to be able to make decisions, to be able to better understand our work. And that really intrigued me. And that wasn't something I expected in my very first job. And so with having that experience, that's actually what prompted me to pursue my doctoral degree. And then I went on to do that at the University of Maryland. And along the way, part of that kind of this exposure to different areas in student affairs, I worked in student conduct there for almost 5 years, actually. So I really had this, broad experience in student affairs, which then starting to be able to acquire the tools to be able to answer more sophisticated questions, particularly with quantitative data through my doctoral studies and doing a certificate in measurement and statistics and evaluation to complement the PhD, really helped set this foundation for me to be able to go into other roles. And so I actually went in to work in institutional research and institutional assessment. And then an opportunity became available here at the University of Delaware as a director of assessment. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is perfect because this can help me get back into student affairs, be able to use the assessment and data skills that I had been sharpening through work and school, but actually be able to use data information to help others make the decisions that they need to make. And so that was very intriguing, very exciting to serve as a director of assessment for a division. I would say that, even while I was doing that, I still maintained my foot in some of these other experiences. So serving as a, hearing board chair or, appellate board member for what was then the student conduct office, it has a new name now. So that was also important for me to continue to be engaged in that way, like kind of on the ground and some of the work that was happening in student affairs in addition to my assessment work. Was mentioned about student affairs assessment leaders as being a home, definitely was a home for me in my career as a assessment professional leading divisional assessment. So shout out to SAAL. It's a wonderful organization and very happy to be here. Now, currently, I am Associate Vice President, where I lead a portfolio of units that includes residence life and housing, our university student centers, fraternity and sorority leadership and learning, our Center for Black Culture, and Center for Intercultural Engagement. So very different from being a director of assessment, but look forward to additional conversation that we have so to kind of understand some of the connections. The last thing I will add to about myself of, kind of where I am right now, I'm also an MBA student. And I think that's actually something really an important part of this journey for me moving into a different role in higher education.
Awesome. Thank you to all three of our panelists. And I love that we have three different functional areas from student affairs represented here. That makes my heart happy. So, Nicole, I think your prior response actually segues well into our next question, which is I'm curious about what experiences or roles prepared you for senior leadership beyond technical assessment expertise. So I will actually pass it to Mike first if you wanted to answer that.
Tori, can you just repeat the question for me because it's sputtered out on me?
Yeah, for sure. So looking back, what experiences or roles most prepared you for senior leadership beyond technical assessment expertise?
Um, I think that the biggest thing was how we collaborate across units. I think I noted during my opening remarks this whole notion of trying to establish a culture of assessment. That didn't happen quickly, and it certainly doesn't happen because one person wants it to happen. And even in as much as leadership matters, and I at the time had a vice president who was a strong champion of it. Even she and I couldn't do it on our own, and so it really did require bringing people along. And so I point to that because I still think my role now as the senior student affairs officer, it's still about bringing people along and getting them to see how there is strength across units, across divisions of the institution. I was doing a little bit of it certainly in Res Life. For those of us that are Res Lifers, that that's a big part of what we do. But the assessment work was really, I think, where I cut my teeth on sitting with people, bringing them along on ideas, empowering them to do the work, to share the kind of work they were doing. Uh, and so for me, on a daily basis, it's about collaboration. It's a relationship business that I think I find myself in leading the division. And I think for me, in a lot of ways, while it maybe began in Res Life, it was certainly honed in my work in leading assessment efforts.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think so much of our assessment work is not just, the positional authority, but then also how are we influencing people? Like, in your words, like how are we bringing them along with this? Because building a culture of assessment is oftentimes, like bringing people along, making people feel comfortable with data. So I really love that. Thank you. Do either of our other panelists have anything they want to add?
I can add the experience. I think that working in assessment, that it really helps cultivate curiosity and a desire to seek information, to be able to form a perspective. I think is very important. That something that we learn along the way, particularly in assessment. Definitely something I saw in my work with student conduct of I need to be able to ask questions. I need to be able to take in information and make meaning of it. And that's what we do in assessment. And that's also something I need to do as a senior leader too, oftentimes to either for myself or even coaching others and not just relying on instinct alone. And I think that that is something of, well, we've always done it this way. Or, well, I have a sense that it's like this. It's like, what, do we really know? Do we ask the question? Like, are we really informed on a particular issue before we need to make the important decision? I would say though that type of skill is, constantly being sharpened through assessment.
Yeah, I'll add that I think my colleagues have referenced this, but that assessment professionals tend to be really good at navigating systems, creating systems, strengthening systems, and those systems are based off of the interpersonal relationships that we have in order to do the collective work that's within a division. So I do think the skill sets you gain in that work with building systems is one thing that has helped me because my last two jobs as a senior leader, when I was at Memphis, I had 5 titles and a bunch of different roles in terms of the leadership team there. But at LSU and here, I've been an associate vice president or assistant vice president previously at LSU around well-being, a place that to some extent I have no business being in because I'm not a clinician. I did supervise health and counseling while I was at Memphis as well, but end of the day, like I am good at this kind of senior level leadership role because I have the ability to navigate, create and navigate and enhance systems. The other thing I would say too is that both my colleagues have been very active both in SAAL but other associations as well. And I do think that when you have the fortune and the privilege of being able to serve in roles in associations and you develop these skill sets, and you can do this whether you're an assessment professional in SAL or somewhere else or whatever, getting perspectives that are outside of your day-to-day work and being engaged in the larger field, I think that also propels you into kind of this ability to lead at a division level because your perspective is different than just your functional area or just your own institution.
And sort of in the opposite of, what prepared you, what have been some of the biggest challenges you've encountered when moving from a director level role into senior leadership? And we'll go ahead and start with Nicole for this one.
Yeah, so one of the things that I would say is that, serving as a director of assessment, oftentimes these positions are departments of one, maybe 1.5 FTE. You might have a full-time person, maybe two. It's typically not the norm to have a very large assessment unit at most institutions. So a lot of the work is somewhat independent. You're independently driving something, but one of the things as a assessment professional and particularly at the director level, if you're serving in division, is you get really good at serving as a project manager of managing a project itself, whether it be development of learning outcomes or maybe a, CAS review or something of that nature. But that transition to now people manager, I would say that was probably one of the biggest transitions. And oftentimes I previously in my career, that wasn't something I had really learned enough about. But now all of a sudden I was in a role when I was, moved into a different senior level position, doing something very different. That was something I really needed to learn more about. Oftentimes, I think, Marianne, you mentioned that in assessment, we have really good experiences that we're gaining to learn how to influence others. But that's not the same thing as supervision, in terms of like policy and all those sorts of things that we have to often learn. And so I would say that is definitely a challenge. And if you're at the same institution, you're making these moves to moving from peer to supervisor can be very difficult. But that would be across any functional area, not just this particular movement. So I'll leave it there and let my other colleagues jump in.
I think I'm going to get whiplash from agreeing with Nicole. There were so many good points there. And this whole idea about navigating systems without the positional authority sometimes, but also managing the projects. I think a lot of times moving to new institutions, there may be a senior leader or an AVP that doesn't really quite understand the way that assessment professionals have navigated all of that. And the lack of supervision, as Nicole pointed out, is certainly a gap that many people will face as they aspire to those positions. The ability to talk about those skills that you've managed through projects, while also maybe how you've been involved in SAL or other associations, the way you've managed people and projects, you need to talk about that in ways that translates to supervising people and units. And I also think that student affairs professional or student assessment professionals tend to also better understand diverse functional areas than they're given credit for. Now, I benefit of coming up through fraternity and sorority life. That is a functional area that has interactions with conduct and housing and all kinds of things. But there could be seen that I'm only like a one lane person, same as what a student affairs assessment professional might be seen as well. Reality is, though, is that you engage with every single department. You understand their primary outcomes. You know what they're working towards. You know how to help them measure that. And then you also know how to tell that story at the division level to senior leaders as well as across the institution in a way that's compelling and grounded in what matters most to what the president wants and those kinds of things. We have to be good at telling those stories because the biggest barrier we do face is that people underestimating just how well prepared we are to lead because leading one person is not the same as like leading 5 different units. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Michael.
I would echo everything that was just said. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, for me, the biggest challenge, continues to be issues around, our greatest resource, which is people. And, in as much as the idea of bringing people together to collaborate early in my assessment sort of experience was key. I think today, in the seat that I'm in, it's still about how are we deploying our staff, our teams, to be doing this work. And obviously, it's different now in leading a division versus when I was doing assessment. You know, as Nicole noted, staff of one, trying to get folks to buy in. But I still remember a colleague, a longtime VP colleague, who I was sitting next to at a dinner about 2 weeks after I started as vice president. And I was like, Steve, what's some advice you would give? And he goes, managing people is going to take up a lot more time than it's taken up before. And that can be good and that can be challenging sometimes too. But that's one of those areas that I think for me, I'm still refining in a lot of ways.
Thank you. I love those answers. It seems like a common theme is there's a lot more supervision, a lot more of that people management in these roles. So we've talked about sort of broadly how senior level roles are different from, sort of assessment, director of assessment type. But I'm curious about how does your day-to-day work, so the work that you're doing every day, differ from your role when you were leading assessment more directly? And I'll turn that over to Dan to answer first.
It's interesting because I'll get to the point in a second, but my dissertation topic was on student affairs values. One of the things that was identified as a foremost value of the profession is the active intentionality. And like I believe strongly that that is my foremost value, that and collaboration. So I start most of my days probably the same way now that I did 14, 15 years ago when I was doing day-to-day assessment work, and that is being intentional about what it is I need to achieve that day. Laura Dean is a past president of CAS, and Laura gave me this guidance once. She represented the American College Counseling Association, worked at UGA and in faculty for a long time. I consider Laura like my student affairs muse. And she said to me once, she said, Dan, I said, how do you get through it all? Like, this is so much to manage. And she said, you just do the next thing, right? And I'm like, wow, that's really simple. But like that's what I believe in terms of how you do the work as an AVP, how I did the work as a student affairs assessment professional. I get up, I figure out what the priorities are, I figure out who I have to engage with, I have to figure out what problems I have to solve, I figure out what collaborations I need to facilitate, what meetings I have to go to, when will I get my work done. It's not a lot different. I just might spend it more engaging with a lot more people than I did when I was a student affairs assessment professional. I spent a lot, I mean, yes, I engaged with people, but there was a lot more project time, as Nicole has articulated. I find that my life now is more driven by the people problems, the unit problems, the trying to solve all the problems. And certainly in this environment, that's not easy either. And so I think the job is really only different in terms of I'm still intentional, but what I'm trying to do is figure out how to create space and time in order to do the work that has to get done while managing a number of problems that I would not have managed in terms of my previous role in assessment.
Yeah, ditto. I mean, I definitely agree with so much of that. And the one thing I will say, a major difference in the day to day is there's higher pressure to be on, so to speak, in a way with assessment that just wasn't necessary, for me. Like it might be if I'm, leading a workshop or, doing a training or doing a presentation on something, but not like necessarily in just my day to day how I move about my workday. So I think that pressure is something that's quite different. And it's a different amount of energy and type of energy to expel that was kind of new for me. And I think another way that manifests is a higher or greater expectation for a deeper level of engagement, being ready to listen. There's an expectation that is like the leader that you need to be ready to be able to step in and do the things and be in it. And that was not something assessment work just didn't require that of me on a day-to-day basis, but it's also invigorating and exciting. It's not a bad thing. But certainly needing to leave room for the emergencies is something like learning how to plan for that, where there might be an assessment emergency, but it's not necessarily, they don't manifest in the same way as the kind of emergencies that happen now, with a need to be able to respond to, that's usually about, health, life, and safety. So yeah.
I would just echo everything that Dan and Nicole alluded to. The other thing I would just simply add, which I think both of my colleagues have also sort of referenced, is you're at the senior level, you're also dealing with pressures that you don't always anticipate. So this notion of day to day, your calendar may look a certain way this evening. My calendar will look a certain way this evening, but it may not look that same way tomorrow morning. And you just need, and again, those pressures are not, if they're divisional pressures, internally, you've got a lot more agency to sort of navigate those. If they're from the president's office or the provost's office or from your board's office, or if you're in a system, the chancellor's office, all bets are off. And so, and there's I think attributable pressures with, well, I actually do need this data point because there's some additional urgency associated with it, not from Mike or Nicole or Dan, but from President Rodriguez in this case, right? Or maybe even Chancellor King, that doesn't give the team the 5-day runway. It's really, maybe if they're lucky, it's a 5-hour runway to get that. So it's navigating some of that. Again, I think we're all doing in our current seats. It's just it's additional pressure in some ways.
But assessment professionals are prepared to get that data faster than anyone else.
Just
Absolutely.
like that. Yeah. Just like that.
Almost predict what's going to be needed. And that's
Right.
a skill set we have to advocate when we're looking for those senior roles.
Or even sometimes like the ability to be able to help someone, further refine or understand, is that really what you want to know? Like, is
Yeah.
that really the question? You know what I mean? Like we do have that ability to do that in ways other people may not be able to.
And it's also, I think, related to that, because I think Nicole raises a good point about, is that really what you're looking at? Or is that really the data or assessment point that would be the most useful to you in making the case for whatever you're trying to do with it? In a similar way, and I'm raising this because it's top of mind for me. I get a request from the president's office before I jumped on this call as we were driving back from this meeting I was in New York. And it's like, I need this thing by tomorrow. And I'm thinking, you're not getting it tomorrow. Like that, I know that is actually not data that is at the ready right now, because it's a little bit of a weird request. And my team is working on 30 other projects right now. And so I need to do what I can to protect their time. And unless you tell me there's some urgency around it, I think this is a Tuesday project, right? And so there's navigating, and there's some politics associated with that you sort of need to navigate as well.
Thank you all. Kind of similar vein, in terms of, challenges perhaps, but also maybe good things. What has surprised you most about the senior leadership role that you didn't really anticipate before you're actually in the role? And that could be, maybe a challenge or even maybe something more positive. And we'll start with Mike for that one.
So a challenge at getting into the senior leadership role?
And not necessarily a challenge, but something that you didn't anticipate until you were actually in the role. And it could be a challenge.
I would just go back to the comment I alluded to a little bit before, was this notion of how much time personnel takes. And it is, and I'll be, this is among friends. It's not always good stuff. It's actually usually not good stuff. Managing good people is a lot easier than managing folks that maybe are not. And we're the University of Albany. We have 17,000 students. We're a unionized organization, so there's labor management that we have to navigate there. I guess I was shocked as to how much time that has taken for me. And these are not, by the way, folks that I'm directly supervising either, by the way, right? I supervise 4 AVPs is really my direct reports, but it's all the residual people across the division that ultimately needs to roll up. So the personnel stuff is is pretty time consuming. And I hadn't, again, I'm 11 years in this now, so I certainly know what it is now. But the first couple of years, I was like, wow, this is like a daily thing, with human resources and unions and things like that. And that, I will tell you, that nothing really prepared. I mean, I supervised staff in Res Life, worked with directors across the division when I was doing assessment, but nothing really prepared me for the personnel challenges.
And I really appreciated, when I think about this too, like I appreciated, Dan, what you were saying about the discipline that you had around, how you wanted to structure your day. And I think part of that is probably having a firm understanding of who you are, and how you work best. And so for me, what really surprised me in the senior leadership role was how important it was for me to have a firm understanding of who I was, who I am as a leader. And that is not something I think that I was ever really encouraged to do in my assessment role. Like that just wasn't it. It just wasn't part of the conversation, at least for me, in my career, like, especially when I was working in institutional research, no one's asking about like, I don't know, who are you as a person or anything like that. We're certainly more inclined to do that in student affairs, but I would say, particularly even in the student affairs assessment space, that was not something I was thinking about at all. Wasn't really on my radar. In terms of how I want to be and show up for others and whatnot. We certainly talk about like things like positionality and whatnot when it comes to analyses and so forth. But and I have spent some time working with an executive coach in this role. I think for maybe about the past 3 years or so. And that has really helped me to achieve some clarity on what mattered to me, who I want to be at work on a daily basis, what I value, and how does that inform how I lead, how I interact with people I supervise, with colleagues, across our division, externally, and so forth, what they can expect of me. And so, in short, really, that time for reflection has been essential, particularly in this role.
I think the benefit of working within student affairs, and some of you go into that directly, maybe never having worked in student affairs before, or maybe you come after a functional area like I did, but you get to learn a little bit about a lot of things. And I think that as a senior leader, that really benefits you. It's really important that I have a general understanding of the primary outcomes and objectives of the functional areas that are in my portfolio. And again, I don't manage a portfolio now that my first 10 years in the field I ever thought I would. But again, the student affairs assessment, the involvement in CAS that I've had, the use of the CAS standards, the ability for me to manage projects that are interdisciplinary in nature, that really talk about student learning across all the functional areas. That benefits me now as an AVP, my second job, LSU for the first one, in the well-being space. And I just think that there's a lot more in common across these areas. But for me, I think that in sitting in your seats, if you aspire towards senior leadership roles, or leadership roles that are at the AVP that might be managing multiple functional areas, it will benefit you a lot to know a good amount about all those areas and demonstrate that as you tell your story about why you're the best candidate for those jobs.
There are very few positions that director level positions that allow you to see the division as broadly as assessment directors or assessment units do, which I think really uniquely positions us to move into senior leadership roles because we've got a flavor for a little bit of everything. Right. I mean, in as much as the three of us introduced where our functional area was born out of, I think that and three different, but the commonality was that we were then in a position to lead assessment efforts for large, complex organizations. There aren't other directors. I mean, with the exception of, depending on how you're organized, there might be a budget person that does that or a personnel person these days. But assessment has that upside. And I will say, for me, I think it was a real, there was some significant upside when I was in a position to be considered for the vice presidency because of the work I had done in engaging all of our units in the division. There was not a single unit that I was not really intimately familiar with at that particular juncture, given my work in looking at their data, quite honestly, but also collaborating with their director and their senior teams. And that I think is an important thing to underscore for student affairs assessment professionals.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. Because I mean, even in the role I'm in now, I wouldn't say I'm as engaged
Right.
in across the division as I was as a
Yeah.
director of assessment. Like, so that is, I mean, absolute truth. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for all those great answers. One of the big takeaways that I'm having from this conversation is it's just making me feel very excited and happy about assessment and all and how great assessment work is. So thank you for bringing some energy and joy into my day. So we're going to transition into audience questions now. Marianne and I have gotten a few questions private message to us. Folks, please feel free to keep those coming or post for the full group to see in the chat. But I will go ahead and get us started here with the first question. So all three of you touched on this in different ways, but really a skill that you're bringing into this role is being able to build a culture of assessment. So what advice would you give to someone about building a culture of assessment, specifically within a team where staff have varying levels of comfort or experience with data? And I'll post the question in the chat as well so folks can see it.
I mean, I think, I think as you're building, for me, it was, again, in the early part of my assessment work, it was really trying to, I know I shared this notion of bringing people along, but I think part of bringing people along was also providing opportunities for them um, to learn, so that they were more comfortable. Because I actually think, as I was reflecting on this conversation today, when I was sort of going back through memory lane, there were directors who were really pushing back hard against assessment, and particularly at the assessment council table. But then one-on-one, when I was in their space, when we were talking, I began to realize, or I quickly realized, that it wasn't because they didn't think assessment was worth doing. They just didn't know what it meant for them. And so, we ended up doing, this was, Dan probably remembers, maybe Nicole does too, but this was like, we were a student voice campus. This was a long time ago now. But at the time, Student Voice was doing these educational webinar types of things. And this was, I think, frankly, before we were all very, very super comfortable with Zoom, right? Where you would it was like assessment 101. How do you bring people along? And so we ended up developing a sort of crash course, sort of a 2-3 module series that Student Voice was presenting, that we'd have our assessment council run through as a way to make them more comfortable with it. And then we would we started doing an in-person gathering training. And then that's when people really began to come around on it, because they didn't feel this vulnerability that they had felt before. I really do point to that as a big part of how we got to a place where we were comfortable talking about assessment, was in learning and teaching what that would look like to colleagues.
Too, for in terms of building a culture of assessment is, and actually I feel like there was a book I used, Michael, I think you wrote, and or maybe a chapter or something, and then also some of the work of Gavin Henning, and I think it's been really informative for me in thinking about the elements of culture in terms of, so when you're building culture, of how do you not just blankly use culture of assessment, and but what does that even mean to people? Because I think a lot of times staff will think that culture just means this, or assessment just means this one thing, and I'm not good at it, so I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater on assessment. So when we think about the various elements of culture, whether it be our champions, our communication, like there are different things that, units, individuals can certainly connect to, lean in. So like, what are those things that most resonate with staff and to help kind of, with some of the buy-in and so forth, so that we can try to speak some language that also speaks to people's interest, their talents, that there is a place for everyone in this. So that's something that always really helped me, was thinking about the various elements of culture, of like, what is it that, what are we really trying to do here? And what are the roles that people play? Because we all don't need to be doing the same thing necessarily, across all levels of the division.
Is this the book, Nicole? Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah. Coordinating divisional assessment. Yeah.
That's what it is. That's right.
Michael carried me on that chapter for sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
What I will say is
Someone read it. Isn't that
I know,
exciting?
thank you. I know. I really appreciate that. Thank you. What I will say is I think not talking about assessment, but talking about a culture of or an ethos of improvement and a commitment to elevating practice speaks better than the term assessment. And I think I just come to realize, I think people default to the methodology around assessment, and I get it. There's a reason that we use methodological practices, but I feel like it would benefit most of our directors to help them think about assessment as a day-to-day practice of just wanting to do their work better. And simply documenting the small things you do on a daily basis, that's a body of like that's assessment, right? Over the course of like 2 months, what have you documented about all the things you've done in order to improve practice? That's an assessment practice. So I just think we need to kind of change the language about what people think constitutes assessment. That's what I would say in terms of strengthening that culture.
Thank you all so much. I love those answers. And I've been in multiple meetings with you, Dan, where you go and you get a book off your shelf and do show and tell. So I think
I do love
that's your
books.
signature
Dan's good
thing.
like
Yeah.
that. He's good like that.
Great. So Tiffany actually put a great question in the chat. For someone who is a leader of a one-person office, what is the first step you would recommend we take if we are interested in a higher leadership position? It's hard to know where to start when the pathway is often not very clear. And then I'm also going to queue up another question in the chat because I got a really good one private message to me, and I want you all to have a chance to think about it. But let's do Tiffany's question first.
Probably practical thing I say that people should do. It's something I do. I actually recommended to, I was meeting with an assistant director in a unit for lunch one day, and we're just talking about career things. And she's like, yeah, I'm interested in moving up. And I said, well, to what? Well, I don't know. Well, okay, well, let's figure it so having an idea of like, where is it you're trying to go? Not just up, but up doing what, where, types of places. But the thing I said is very practical is start looking at job descriptions for things that you think you might want to do. And I am someone who I am always looking at job descriptions all the time, job postings, like, oh, that's interesting. Cause like, how are they doing that in this place? And that can also help you better understand what it is that jobs might be asking someone to do. And then that can help you then determine, okay, where's the gap here between what might be expected or required in this role and what I have right now, what I can bring? Are there things I could be skilling up on, different networking I should be doing to better understand the work? Because I think something I feel like I've seen in my career are I'm climbing and I'm like, have you taken a minute to even figure out, is this really what you want to do? Not because it's what you think the expectation is of the thing to do next. And so, yeah, I'm very practical. I was looking at job postings yesterday, not because I'm looking for a job, but because I was like, oh, I'm just kind of curious. Like, how are people describing work now versus maybe what this role looked like in student affairs 5 years ago, or so.
I don't have a lot to add. I do love that idea of looking at job descriptions for the positions to which you're aspiring and identifying the competencies that you see there, and then documenting, reflecting about the ways that you're developing those competencies in the work that you're doing. Now, that might be done on your off time, right? But also, it can be a good way to reflect daily about how you're doing your work. Yeah, I think the one person shop, I lived that. It was a little bit of a weird dynamic. I had a grad assistant, but I feel that. I also think that approaching the work through the consultant framework, like where do people need me? I am not everything to everyone. I come in at certain stages of the assessment or continuous improvement cycle, and here's how I'm going to show up for the people that need me. But I think not trying to be everything to everyone or doing all the things assessment-wise, methodologically especially, is really important there.
I wouldn't get too caught up in the one person office, quite honestly. Like I don't think that that should completely hamstring one's ability to advance. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing I would just suggest, in addition to everything Nicole and Dan just noted, is dabble in some aspiring AVP or VP type programming that NASPA offers. Because again, I was on the faculty for one of the aspiring VPSA programs that we did, and I think that and there were folks from all over different units. That's good exposure, not only because it can help you maybe find a track that will drive you towards senior leadership, but also I think importantly, and this happened for a couple of students in my cohort, also you might realize that you don't want to be a senior leader. And that I think is an equally important realization. Which is probably hard to talk about now because of the two-part series that we're doing right now, because we want folks to be considering it. But it's not like what we tell our students, right? Go and get the internship early, not just because you're going to go be you think you want to be a lawyer, and then you go intern, your sophomore, somewhere between your freshman and sophomore year, and you're like, oh my God, like this is really bad stuff. Well, better to realize it now than when you're a first-year law student, right? Same sort of thing with this. I mean, I think, my hope is, of course, you'd all aspire to do it, but, maybe it's not your jam, and that's totally fine too. But these aspiring institutes that NASPA does, they've got an aspiring AVP and an aspiring VP. Give it a go and see. Because then you'll also encounter peers from outside of the assessment space who might be asking the same sort of question, like, is this something I want to do? How do you do it? Where do you begin? And that's what those institutes are designed for. So give that some consideration as well.
Awesome. Thank all three of you. So along those lines of, are you sure you really want to do this job? We got a great question in the chat, which is how do you manage being in the public eye, either for good news or bad news, which I think as an assessment person, the idea of stepping out from behind the scenes can be really intimidating. So curious about everyone's thoughts on that.
I guess I'll start. I mean, when you're in these, certainly when you're in these senior leadership roles, and particularly when you're the vice president, I mean, there's a lot of public exposure you're going to get. It's certainly not as glamorous as I think it looks. I remind sort of students who are like, oh, you've got the best job, and I'm not saying I don't. It's a great job. I love my job. It's my dream job, but there's some stuff that's not great about being in the public eye. Right. And including occasionally needing to carry water that's presenting some not great news to students, to staff, to others. It's how we navigate all of that. It's also, keeping some of our opinions and things in check, right? You can't, there's some flexibility that I may have had as a director or assistant director that I just can't. I can't say certain things at this level, and that can be challenging. But you're also, uniquely positioned to be the spokesperson for great stuff too, which I love. Right, President did his spring university address on Tuesday, and opening 7 minutes was all about how great the Division of Student Affairs and Enrollment was. Right, like I love that. There's nothing. What's there not to love? Photographs and videos of my team. That's all great. So like you noted in the question, there's some good and there's some bad, but it certainly is not. It's not all glamour for sure.
Great. So we'll have time for one more question. I see that there's one more posted in the chat. We might only have time for one or two people to answer this, but please speak to addressing the critique of assessment leaders not having the experience of managing significant financial or material resources and one portfolios when seeking senior leadership roles.
Dan and Nicole can jump in. I think that's a bunch of hooey, quite honestly. I mean, I think that's a bad critique in my mind. I don't think that's accurate. I actually think that to my earlier characterization of where assessment leaders sit in the organization, we're better positioned, I would say, to see the division, including financial resources, by the way, because if you're doing it right, you're using good data to help inform resource allocation. That needs to be the angle that we use, and that needs to be the angle that we in our work that we continue to use with our VPs in this case, right? Particularly at a time when resources are limited, right? This in some ways, regardless of where you sit, there is a true demographic cliff in the enrollment space that I think some of us are more inclined to want to talk about than others. I'm certainly feeling it in New York. That's a fact, right? So there's a very loud sucking sound. Some of it is us pulling students from other institutions, but some of it's also resources that we know are not going to be there in a year or two, right? There was news the other day, Hampshire College is closing, right? There are real realities associated with this. And I really think that positioning assessment in our work is key to how we are deploying resources, is an angle that I think further poo-poos this critique, quite honestly. But that's just a Mike take.
I don't know if Dan, if you had something, 'cause I know we don't have much time, but I think one of the things too, it's just like, do you have the significant experience managing that? No. But I think even with it, I think like even me as like a hiring manager, I'm also aware too of what is it specifically that someone would be asked to do, regarding like resource, like, are you allocating the resources? Are you trying to understand the resource? Like they're like, even for me, I'm not like in the back end system counting the coins for my university. Like that's somebody else's job who's really, really in it with the finance, And so like I think some of it is we all have our own role to play in it, and understanding that. And I think I feel like that issue, not that it doesn't come up at all, but I even think about like in hiring of like, we can teach a lot of that to people. Like, also because how some of the expectations, how budgeting works can be so different by institution. So I might know at my institution, our process for budgeting and resource allocation, and I go somewhere else and it's totally different philosophy, totally, different stance on how we use money, what we prioritize. Like, so all of that is very context dependent in many ways. So, and even in terms of the expectation of what a senior leader needs to be able to do regarding budget at times.
Any last minute thoughts, Dan or anyone else? All right, well, as we wrap up, let's give our speakers a round of applause and a huge thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to spend with us. Thank you, Dr. Bureau, Dr. Christakis, and Dr. Long for sharing your insights. We're very grateful to have you here with us. A recording of today's session, along with any resources, will be shared via email and available on SAAL's website. And we do have a second part to this Pathway to Senior Leadership series, so we'll hope you join us for that session, which will be on May 14th, and focus on skills that can help lead to career advancement. So you can register now on the SAAL website. And thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you. See ya.